Frank Grayson, and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics here at Kennedy School. I want to welcome everybody tonight to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum for tonight's forum. We've got a great topic, a great panel. Tonight's panel is going to be moderated by the Robert and Renee Belfer, Professor of International Affairs here at the Kennedy School, Stephen Walt, and he's going to in turn introduce all of our panelists. So please join me in welcoming Professor Walt. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Welcome to this panel discussion on the continuing confrontation with Iran. Not only is this a topic of enormous real-world significance, but it's also a topic that in some respects might be thought of as deeply puzzling. Suppose for a minute that a being from Mars came down and tried to make sense out of the confrontation we have with Iran. They might find this somewhat hard to understand. You have the United States, which spends about $700 billion a year on national security affairs. The State of Israel, which spends about $16 billion, arrayed against Iran, which currently spends about $10 billion on national security affairs. You have the United States and Israel, both with substantial nuclear weapon stockpiles. Iran, of course, with none. You have the United States, which has several dozen military bases in or around the neighborhood of Iran. Iran, of course, has no military bases anywhere near the United States. The United States and Israel have each fought several wars in recent years. Iran's last war was when it was attacked by Saddam Hussein back in 1980. Iranian leaders have made a number of outrageous statements over the past several years as well, but of course prominent American politicians have called for regime change in Tehran, and both the United States and Israel are reliably believed to have engaged in a variety of forms of covert action against Iran. And yet it is the United States and Israel who portray Iran, perhaps with some reason, as a growing threat, who appear to be thinking about using military force to deal with that threat. That might be the right way to think about it, but it seems to me our Martian friend might have at least a little bit of trouble understanding what the fuss was about, given that these two powerful states were actually apparently quite worried. Well, fortunately, I don't have to try and resolve this puzzle for you because we have a distinguished set of panelists who can do that as well, and I want to start by introducing them now. First is Nazila Fathi. She is an Iranian by birth. She is a former reporter for the New York Times who covered Iran from 1999 to 2009 when she was forced to flee the country in the aftermath of the upheaval following the 2009 elections. He's been a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard and is currently a fellow at our Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School. Next is Chuck Freilich, Senior Fellow here at the Belfer Center, former Deputy National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. Oh, my apologies. My apologies.
I'm a civil servant, not a political appointment.
Okay. He also holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University and is the author of a forthcoming book on Israeli national security policy making, which I'm pleased to report is coming out in a book series that I co-edit. So watch for that later this year. Next is Steve Miller, Director of the International Security Program here at the Belfer Center. He's also a member of the leadership of International Pugwash and has been involved in a number of Track 2 diplomacy missions with Iranian officials, including several visits to Tehran. Last but not least, our friend and colleague David Sanger, who is the Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, also an adjunct lecturer here at the school, where he co-teaches a course with Graham Allison. So that's our panel, and I want to start by asking Nazila a question based a little bit on her experience. You've reported from inside Tehran. You've got extensive experience with the regime there, not always pleasant experiences. In your view, why is Iran persisting on a course that has led to increasing sanctions, covert action, diplomatic isolation, and growing hardships for the Iranian people?
Well, Steve, I'm not sure if the uncompromising position that Iran has right now would have existed 10 years ago. But in the past 30 years since the formation of the Islamic Republic, the regime has constantly been faced with threats. I mean, within a year after the victory of the revolution, Saddam attacked Iran. Iran was involved in a bloody war for 8 years. And ever since its formation, the Islamic Republic has been faced with the threat of being overthrown. It looks like the nuclear program and having possibly nuclear capability is not only a matter of national pride, but is also something that somehow creates a kind of protection for the Iranian regime. They've seen Pakistan, after the Pakistanis had nuclear capability, had nuclear weapons, they were very much involved in talks with the United States, especially over Afghanistan. And they believe very much that once they have reached a certain capability, the Americans would recognize them as a regional power, as a country that has influence in the Middle East, and that it can be past the stage that it can be overthrown. And in the past several years that we've seen, the Iranian regime has sort of convinced people that this is a matter of national pride. It has compared the nuclear program to nationalization of oil in 1953. And now when you talk to people, when I was in Tehran, when I talked to people on the street and I asked them, what do you think about the nuclear program? Without knowing what the costs had been, without knowing what threats it might bring, they all said it's all right. So it's something that the regime, despite many differences that it has with its own internal factions, has turned to rely on. And the Iranian supreme leader seems to be quite uncompromising. Just 2 weeks ago, he gave a speech, and once again he stressed that Iran will not bow to the pressures of the sanctions.
If I can follow up with just one other question. It's hard often to know exactly what the opinion of the Iranian people are, particularly from the outside. Certainly the amount of pressure that seems to be exerted on Iran now has gone up significantly in the last year or two, with more stringent sanctions being imposed. There's evidence now of genuine economic hardship being induced by them. Do you think that some of that national consensus that you were describing, where it's seen as a source of national pride, might be eroding now that, in some respects, the cost of this may be more obvious to the Iranian people? And is that something that the regime has to start worrying a little bit about?
I'm sure the regime will have to worry about it even more within the next 6 months. Already we see that the value of the Iranian currency has plunged to half since 6 months ago. I was talking to some friends today, and they said people are just buying grains and rice because they're afraid that there will be a serious shortage. The inflation is really bad, definitely. But even when I was in Iran before 2009, there was 2 ways to ask people about how they felt about the nuclear program. First, you ask them, how do you feel about the nuclear program in general? And the first answer was, well, if we had nuclear weapons in 1980, Saddam wouldn't have attacked. And I hadn't asked about nuclear weapons. I had asked about nuclear program. And then when I asked them if they knew about the costs involved, how much Iran had already spent to have this so-called nuclear program, and whether they would have liked to see, for example, free meals once a week or some kind of subsidies that would affect directly their lives, they would change their answers and they would say, yes, well, if the costs are so high, we prefer not to have the nuclear program and benefit from the costs in some other ways. So even back then, it all depended on how you put the question. People's answers varied.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I would like to turn to Charles Freilich now and ask you a question about Israeli thinking on this issue. As I read the Israeli press, which I do fairly frequently, there seems to be a consensus that Iran is a serious problem, but there's a considerable range of opinion on just how serious or imminent the problem is, with some, say, on the right, thinking that it is an existential threat. Others, such as the former Mossad chief, Meir Dagan, saying this is a problem, but it is not an existential threat, at least not at the moment. Can you say a little bit about sort of the range of views within Israel, where they come from, and what the thinking is now?
Sure. First of all, let me just say one thing before that. I think that the title that was given to the talk tonight is a mistaken one, because it puts the focus on the threat of military action. And that's not the primary threat. The primary threat is that Iran is developing a nuclear program. According to just about anybody in the know, in the world. That's what we should be focusing on. Unfortunately, because of all the media coverage lately, the focus is now on the potential for attack. So first of all, let me try and ease anyone's fears in the room today. I can tell you, and this is a true story, a group of Israeli citizens just wrote the Prime Minister and asked him to postpone any potential military action until after Madonna's concert in Israel on May 29th. So no imminent danger. It's a true story, and yes, there are morons in all countries.
Which suggests if you're trying to avoid war, we need to have a series of rock stars going to concerts.
So maybe Steve
this is a new theory of peace here.
Springfield in the fall. Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
But let me now try and answer your question. Israel, I will probably not surprise most of the people in the audience, is a country in which just about every issue is debated politically and fiercely. This is one issue in which there is a strong debate at the moment, and Steve correctly pointed it out. In some ways, it's a narrow debate, but I think it's also an extremely fundamental, extremely important debate. There is no debate within the Israeli defense establishment, and not much beyond that a nuclear Iran would pose a dire threat to Israeli security. The question is whether, and here's where the divergence of views is, whether it's an existential threat. Some people say yes, it is simply existential. The difference between dire and existential, to my way of thinking, is that if it's just a dire threat, there aren't too many countries in the world that have to deal with dire threats, that leaves you some flexibility in how you respond. If it's existential, then really the logical conclusion is that Israel must take every action that it possibly can. And the people who are in the dire camp to say, well, we should go pretty far, but we don't have to do everything. The question here, I think, you spoke of your hypothetical Martian. I think he might look at it a little bit differently, or she. It's not a question of the fact that the United States spends $700 billion and Israel $16 billion and Iran only $10 billion. The question is what the different countries' intentions are. And I think, by the way, I want to go back to what Nazila was saying. I think Iran has got very, very good strategic reasons for wanting a nuclear capability. Okay? If I was an Iranian strategist, which I am not, I think I would probably want a nuclear capability if I could get one also. They are deeply afraid of the United States. I think they view the United States as their primary national security threat. The United States toppled 2 neighboring regimes in the space of 2 years and was then talking about toppling the Iranian regime. The current administration is not, but who knows what's going to happen in November or 4 years from now. Steve mentioned they fought a horrifically bloody war with Iraq, an 8-year war, lost 500,000 people in that war. It is an open trauma for them. And then, yes, there's Israel, and they also don't like the fact that there are India and Pakistan as nuclear powers in their backyard. Pride, as Nazila was saying. I think Iran has very good reasons for wanting a nuclear capability. And because they have good reasons from their point of view, I think that the price of trying to get them to give it up is very, very high. There's nothing less than extreme pressure which might, and I stress the word might. I think after 15 years of, more than that, more like 18 years of less than effective international pressure, and I think Israel should get a great deal of credit for putting this issue on the international map close to 20 years ago. I've been warning about this. Now, finally, the international community seems to be taking effective steps with the impending oil embargo. And this is maybe, this combined with the other financial sanctions, may be the one thing that holds out some hope for a diplomatic solution, which is obviously everyone's preference, and I think no one more than Israel.
Okay, great, thank you. This is a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask Steve Miller. So you have had, over the past few years, extensive conversations with Iranian academics, with a number of former government officials. How does this issue look from their perspective, and why hasn't diplomacy succeeded when it has been tried on numerous occasions in the past?
Well, I would start with a point that Chuck already alluded to. The Iranian regime fears and distrusts us at least as much as we distrust it, but with the significant caveat that they're going up against the planet's 800-pound gorilla, right? So this is not an equal fight from their point of view. When you talk to Iranian analysts and the think tanks in Tehran, they say, our profound strategic predicament is that we have to try and deter the United States of America. And how do they view the United States of America? And by the way, they're not alone in seeing us this way. We're violent, we're war-prone, we're lawless, we're reckless, and we're relentless. And so the punchline is we're dangerous, all right? And if you're Iran and you're trying to mobilize your deterrence assets, what can you do to stop this juggernaut, all right? So that feeds into Chuck's point about why they might have an incentive to have a nuclear weapon. So all diplomacy with Iran unfolds under this backdrop of fear and distrust that they have toward us. There are countless people in Tehran that you run into who are in favor of some sort of rapprochement with the United States. The fear is that they don't know how to do it and that we will exploit it, that somehow we will use the diplomatic process against us. So that's the wider canvas. So then the next layer down is, do they think we're serious about a deal? And the answer is, they don't really think we're interested in negotiating, and they don't think we really want a deal. What they think we want is regime change. This is, in fact, the official policy of the United States. It's codified in our law. It's articulated by many of our political leaders, and it is undoubtedly the genuine preference of most of our political elite. So this is not an idle fear on Iran's part, but then this gets to the position of the supreme leader, who everybody in Washington sees as the great barrier to negotiation. The supreme leader keeps saying, how can we do a deal with these people who are trying to destroy us? And if their policy is regime change, then by definition, any offer they're making is compatible with that policy or objective. And then they look at Libya and they say, well, Gaddafi did a deal with the Americans, and look what good it did him. He ended up getting crushed. So that's a second layer. A third layer is that we've had, when there has been the occasional effort to negotiate, we've had irreconcilable starting positions. We say, on our side, Iran needs to be pressured into negotiating seriously. Iran's leaders have been saying continuously, both before Ahmadinejad and since Ahmadinejad took power, we're willing to negotiate any time, but not under pressure. And we have said, we'll negotiate as soon as you stop your enrichment program, and they have said, we'll negotiate any time, but we won't stop our enrichment program. So we've had this kind of stymied stopping effect at the very get-go of everything. Then there's a last dimension, I would say, which is it's never been clear what we want in a negotiation. What deal is it that Washington and the West are looking for, other than something which Iran would see as capitulation? Iran, in the course of the last 7-8 years, has offered to allow continuous IAEA presence at its nuclear facilities. It's offered to perpetuate short-notice inspections, of which it has had more than all other states in the IAEA and the NPT system combined. It offered to limit the number of centrifuges. It offered to be subjected to a limit on the level of enrichment that they can achieve. At what point in 2005, Iran, in the context of the EU3 negotiations, Iran offered to link its, the word they use is synchronized, to link the amount of enrichment it did to its reactor fuel needs, which was a really pivotal kind of suggestion because their fuel needs are zero for the foreseeable future, then and for the foreseeable future. And so this was a very clever way for the Iranians to be able to say to their domestic audience, we will enrich as much as necessary, and then they turn to the international audience and basically say, and of course nothing is necessary for as far as the eye can see into the future. They have only the one reactor. It's covered by a fuel services contract with Russia. If they put their own fuel in there, they void all of the guarantees and insurance covering that facility. So they have no need to. Now, we have, on our side, ignored or rejected every one of these offers. We don't know how serious they were. We don't know if they were genuine. We don't know if we had tried to achieve deals on these various items that we would have succeeded. But the Iranian view is they've tossed out what they call possible solutions time and time again, and what they get is the back of our hand.
Okay. I have to push you on one issue. Now, you often hear that, yes, but the Obama administration came in and the first thing they did was try to extend a hand to the Iranian regime with a very well-publicized, orchestrated, reaching out of the presidential handshake, both rhetorically and in some other ways. We did finally have direct one-on-one conversations with the Iranians. And again, the rhetoric in Washington, and I will get to David in a second, but the rhetoric is we tried, it failed, they rejected the overture, and therefore that path appears to be closed, that they're just not willing to do a serious negotiation. You want to comment briefly on that, and then I want to turn to David.
Sure. I mean, the Iranians were as suspicious of Obama as of any other American leader. And what they said over and over again was, if Obama translates his warm rhetoric into actual deeds, then we will welcome an extensive engagement. But if he turns out to be just Bush with nicer words, then we're not interested. Well, from the day after his election, when he got out of the blue a question at his day after news conference about Iran, where he invoked the standard Washington harsh rhetoric, to the failure to respond to Ahmadinejad's congratulatory letter, to the appointment of 3 of the biggest Iran hawks in Washington to populate the highest reaches of his administration, starting with Hillary, but including Dennis Ross and Gary Seymour. The people who had the Iran account in the Obama administration were well-known people who were on the tougher side, who had openly voiced skepticism about engagement. Then the engagement turned out to be 2 half-day meetings in Europe in October of 2009, in which, when the Iranians refused to accept our position, lock, stock, and barrel, we dismissed them as having rejected the offer and said that engagement had been tried and failed. And then we jumped right back vigorously into the sanctions track that is no different whatsoever in the Iranian eyes from Bush, with the single exception that the Obama administration has been pursuing this track more effectively.
Okay. Thank you. Which brings me to David Sanger. You spend most of your time watching the Obama White House, and as I understand it, are now writing a book on Obama's national security policy. So how does this look from the vantage point of the Obama White House? What are they hoping is going to happen, and what do they think is going to happen?
Very good question, and they're 2 very different things. First, their interpretation of events, it won't shock you, is different from the one that they viewed that they came in after the Bush administration. The Bush administration had not made a serious offer for unconditional conversation with Iran. The president early on did a radio broadcast, you may remember, directly to the Iranian people on the Iranian New Year, sent letters to the Supreme Leader and to Ahmadinejad, and in their view, got back diatribes that were similar to what you sort of hear in public. So they've had what I would call a 3-part strategy in which each part has been running simultaneously. An offer for diplomacy, which is still open, and in fact today the Iranians finally, after many a month, sent a letter to Cathy Ashton, who runs the European-led negotiating team, to suggest that they may, under some conditions, be willing to come back. The second thing that they have run is the sanctions policy, and if you go into the WikiLeaks trove, you'll discover that the administration was revving up the sanctions, preparing for them in 2009 and through early 2010 on the assumption that the Iranians would turn down most of the openings for diplomacy. And in fact, after the June elections in 2009 and after the protests on the streets that were put down so brutally, pretty much all discussion ended. I think there was a sense in the administration, certainly in the intelligence community, that nobody in Iran felt as if they could reach out and show what they might view as weakness by negotiating after they had been through this electoral process, which, of course, Nazila witnessed firsthand. And then the third thing they had going was a very active covert program. And part of what we do at the Times is try to cover all 3 elements of this, obviously covering the covert program is the hardest, but there has been a remarkable number of things that have gone badly for the Iranians over a number of years. They bought a bad centrifuge design from the Pakistanis, one that the Pakistanis were selling for the same reason, Steve, that you might offer me your used car, if you knew that it wasn't driving terribly well, okay? They bought into that, and it doesn't operate very well. They've been hit by sabotage of all kinds. They get parts that have been sent, as I reported in a book I did 3 years ago, back to Los Alamos National Laboratory, where they were improved and then delivered on to the Iranians. And what do you know? The centrifuges blow up early on. They've had computer viruses of a mysterious nature that we've all read about. All of this is designed, if you believe the administration, to try to make the Iranians come to the conclusion that a negotiated solution is really their only option, that the pressure on sanctions will increase, that the covert program will slow the program down, and that eventually they'll come around. And this gets to the existential question about negotiating with Iran, which is that the Iranians will tell you that pressure never works to bring them to the table. The administration believes pressure never works until it becomes so overwhelming that one day it works. And that's the test that you're seeing play out. And the threats of attack by Israel, you could argue, play into that very strategy. In other words, if you were trying to make the Iranians believe they needed to come to the negotiating table, the belief that they could wake up one morning and discover that they have lost the Natanz plant might, in fact, be another reason to come and negotiate. That would be the case if the United States and Israel were neatly locked up on the same strategy. But the problem is, it's not just the Iranians who are wondering whether or not the Israelis are going to attack. The Americans are wondering whether the Israelis are going to attack. They're happy to have the Israeli pressure in theory, but if you believe what they say to me, they believe an attack itself would be detrimental. Now, that gets to your question, what do they want to happen versus what do they think will happen? What they want to happen is for the pressure to be so overwhelming that the Iranians show up at the table and actually negotiate a real deal that just buys them more time by basically getting out of the country enough of the nuclear material that Iran would not have enough on hand to build a weapon. And then they believe you could talk for a while. And that's what 2009 was all about. It was a deal on the table that would have brought enough fuel out of Iran that it would have bought you some time. Now, however, the Iranians have produced enough, you need to bring a lot more fuel out. Then what do they think is going to happen? They don't think, at least no one I have interviewed in my work as a reporter and work on this forthcoming book, that the Iranians are going to take the deal on the table. They think that instead they will try to extend out negotiations for a period of time, and the mystery is, would Israel attack prior to the presidential election? And if you're the Israelis, you have to think that attacking prior to the election gives them an advantage that they wouldn't have after the election, which is that President Obama would probably be constrained in the degree to which he could criticize Israel for attacking prior to the election for fear of alienating important constituencies in the United States. And so that's all part of the political context here. I think most people I talk to in the White House think it's sort of 50-50 about whether there'll be an attack. They also believe an attack would probably be less beneficial in slowing the program than other approaches, because their fear is that an attack would set it back 2 or 3 years, but drive the program further underground, and that we'd be back where we are today in a couple of years.
Great. I want to push you on it. You've given us actually a very nice Graham Allison Model 1 analysis of the Obama administration.
There's a reason I teach with Graham, because he taught me what Model 1 was.
He taught all of us what Model 1
right.
was.
And I had forgotten it from being an undergraduate in the class, so, you know.
So without giving away sources, unless, of course, you'd like to, how unified is the view within the administration? Chuck described a range of opinion within the Israeli context, not an incredibly wide range, but there was some divergence. In your conversations with the Obama administration across different agencies and within the White House, are they pretty much all on the same page, or do you get significant disagreements that we haven't heard about all that much?
More disagreements in 2009, when some believed that the outreach was actually going to slow the effort at sanctions and so forth, than I detect today. I think what has happened now is that the Iranians have made enough progress that there seems to be a fairly good unanimity of opinion that ramping up the pressure is their main option that is left. And you've seen a big turn in the pressure increase, as you noted, in the past 6 months. Why is that? It all, I think, comes down to a giant underground facility outside of Qum, a facility that President Obama had to reveal publicly in 2009 when the Iranians began to make some noises about it, but the U.S. had followed it for some time. It is this facility, which is built so deeply that it is unlikely that an Israeli or an American attack could really get down deep at it, that has led to the Israeli theory, or really Defense Minister Barak's theory, of a zone of immunity. And that is to say that once the Iranians get this facility up and running, and there are ways from that, good ways from that, that they would have all the time in the world to work on a nuclear program because they would know that it was essentially bomb-proof. Now, the Americans don't agree with that. The American assessment is there are all kinds of ways to stop the program. You can stop their oil revenues. You can put embargoes on out in the Persian Gulf. You can increase the covert program. The Israeli view is, or at least the stated Israeli view, is that once that facility is up and running, there's no way to back off the program, and therefore there is a limited time here. I put in the caveat, and Chuck can talk about this, the Israelis have said before that there are red lines that Iran could not pass, and the Iranians have passed it, and the Israeli response has been, well, there's a new red line.
Okay, great. The advantage in being a moderator at an event like this is you can ask all sorts of awkward questions that you yourself don't have to answer. So I actually want to ask the other three panelists the same question that I posed to David about the Obama administration, but I want to ask you in your own independent guise. Namely, what do you hope will now happen, and what do you think is going to happen? Starting with Steve.
Well, Iran now has a latent nuclear capability, which is inherent in the technology path that they've chosen. They pursued the dual-use technologies of just the sort that the NPT regime tries to discourage. It doesn't really matter what their intentions were or are. As a fact of science and technology, they have an option to enrich material to a weapons grade and to manufacture weapons if they so choose. That's where we are today. I would add as a parenthesis, given that we have been predicting an Iranian nuclear weapon in about 2 years since 1984, there is a question if they're so hell-bent on nuclear weapons, why they don't have them. But it seems to me, given where we are and given the firm stands that Iran has staked out, that our goal has to be to put as many barriers as possible, legal, technical, political, and maybe even moral, between Iran's existing capability and the actual weaponization of that capability. A lot of this would be very technical and have to do with inspection and transparency. There's a huge amount that one could do that would provide us with a lot of information, a considerable amount of assurance about how the known facilities are being used, and would give us the certainty of relatively quick warning should these facilities be diverted to weapons purposes. We might also try to negotiate arrangements that Iran has in the past said it was open to, that would involve international involvement, even joint equity positions in Iran's nuclear facilities. Very difficult to cook the books or to have double books if you've got a partner, Westinghouse or Toshiba or one of the big Western companies, Arriva from France, involved in the actual operation of the facilities. In the early days of this crisis, which admittedly was before Ahmadinejad, Iran several times invoked this idea of, well, if you're worried about our enrichment program, invest in it. We welcome you. We were at the time sitting on a position of zero enrichment, and so that is the only acceptable outcome for us was zero enrichment in Iran, and therefore this didn't look like a very appetizing approach, and in fact it looked like a clever way for Iran to get us to accept enrichment on Iranian soil. There have been a whole slew of ideas about multinationalization or internationalization of the enrichment facility on Iran, which would similarly have this characteristic of penetration by outsiders. And if you think about things like dual use of the human beings, if guys are disappearing for stretches and then coming back, this will get noticed, that is, if Iranian nuclear scientists are basically leading a double life. Much easier to notice that if you have your own people at the facilities and things like that. There are thresholds that you could create. For example, at one point the Iranians offered to accept a ceiling of 5% enrichment at its, this is not required or mandated by anything in the NPT regime or anything in their safeguards arrangement. But what it means is that if you find any trace from your environmental sampling that is higher than 5%, then Iran has committed a violation, and this is a grounds for significant suspicion. So now that doesn't prevent the ultimate breakout scenarios, and there is no solution either to the ultimate breakout scenario or to the covert weapons program. If they have a covert program, the military option doesn't take care of that, the diplomatic option doesn't take care of it, and what it means is we're going to be coping with a nuclear-armed Iran somewhere down the road. But there are a number of things we could do to give ourselves some buffering and some warning. That requires that we're willing to make a deal, and it requires that we're willing to make concessions, and it requires that we're therefore willing to actually sit down and make peace with this regime in one way or another, and I'm not sure that we're prepared to do any of those things.
Chuck, same question. What do you hope will happen? What do you think will happen?
I think, first of all, the good news is that we finally do have a serious international effort underway. And both the focus of the title today and much of the attention recently has been on the Israeli response. But this isn't just or even primarily an Israeli problem. The Arab countries are at least as concerned about a nuclear Iran as Israel is. As a matter of fact, again, to mention WikiLeaks, we saw the Saudi and Jordanian leadership turning to the United States and actually asking the United States to attack. And I think the international community is very concerned about what it means for the future of international security, for the future of the efforts to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons. If Iran goes nuclear, after North Korea did, and after Iraq and Syria and Libya all had nuclear programs as well. But if you're asking me in terms of the Israeli response, what Israel should do, first of all, I think that this is an issue, certainly all Israelis, but I think everyone addressing this issue, and including critics of Israel, I share some of the criticism of our policies, but this is an issue on which I believe it behooves everyone to show a degree of humility, because the stakes here are potentially devastating. Now, I said that there is an argument or a debate in Israel. Is this absolutely existential, or it's just dire? Well, dire threats are dire. I am very, very happy that I'm not in government, and I'm very happy that I'm not in Prime Minister Netanyahu's position, and I don't have to make the decision on this. Because on the one hand, you have what may be an existential threat. And for the Jewish people, the term existential threat is not some sort of artificial term. It's not vague. We know what it means. Just a few decades ago, we looked into the abyss and there was no one there. And Iran speaks today openly about Israel's extermination. And just, I think it was the week before last, the supreme leader spoke of Israel as being a cancerous tumor which has to be removed. So we have to take this threat as being very, very serious. Not dealing with it, of course, can be catastrophic. Dealing with it is obviously very problematic at best. First of all, I believe that Iran will retaliate significantly against Israel. They have a few hundred Shihab rockets. I would imagine they won't fire all of them, but a significant portion. More importantly, they have built up an unprecedented rocket arsenal in Lebanon, Hezbollah, today estimated to be something like 50,000 rockets. And I can tell you there's no army in the world that has 50,000 rockets, and it's all aimed exactly at we know whom. Hamas today has many thousands, not like Hezbollah. I think they're going to open up with a great deal of this against Israel, and I'm also happy to say that Defense Minister Barak recently said something else publicly. He said his estimate of the potential damage was far more limited than I personally fear, and I hope he's right. He's more up to date, certainly, on the information than I am today. But I think on the outside, and that's not the only response, we have to take into account that in the current situation after the Arab Spring, which in many ways, of course, has brought about very welcome developments, but the future of the peace between Israel and Egypt is today in question, and Syria is in less than a stable position at the moment, so that Israeli action, if it happens, could potentially lead, God forbid, perish the thought, to warfare with Syria and Egypt even. And then take into account that there will be a highly difficult, problematic international response, and the U.S. response will at best be very critical. I believe that it'll blow over after a few months, but at least the initial response will be very difficult. So, I mean, this is one of the heaviest, most crucial decisions that any Israeli premier has ever had to make. It may be one of the 3 greatest decisions ever. And I think, again, people on the outside, we all have to be careful here because we don't have all the information. We really don't. And to make a truly informed decision, you have to be privy to some of that information. To what extent is Israel or the United States, whoever, really confident that we know where the targets are? To what extent do you think that it is operationally feasible? That nobody thinks you can destroy it. And the question is whether you can achieve a few-year delay. Can we do that? What is the anticipated response on the part of Iran and Hezbollah? These are things that I think most of us in the room don't know. I just want to say one last thing in response to what David was saying before about whether the American elections are or not a component in Israeli thinking. I'm usually a cynical person. This is a degree of cynicism which goes beyond me, I must say. To think that, I don't want to say that it's not a consideration whatsoever. Of course it is. When the United States sneezes, the entire world has a severe disease. So of course Israel takes into account American political cycles. Like every time the U.S. breathes, Israel takes it into account. I can tell you from years in the government in Israel, in virtually every meeting I ever attended, the potential American response was the first issue of discussion. I used to say to my colleagues sometimes, hey guys, first let's figure out what the Israeli policy should be, then we'll discuss the American policy. But it was almost unimportant. What does the U.S. want? What does the U.S. think? The thought that Israel would do this really because of the electoral cycle, I mean, if Israel makes this incredibly difficult decision, for which Prime Minister Netanyahu will be damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. There is no correct decision here. That consideration seems to me to be totally minor.
I want to go to the audience in just a moment, but Nazila, same question?
Well, the rhetoric, both in Israel and Iran, is moving more and more towards war. I mean, as it was mentioned just 2 weeks ago, Iran's supreme leader, made this very, very harsh statement that Iran would take part in any kind of military or political activity that is against Israel, is targeted at Israel. And this is like the harshest statement that he has made in the recent years. But what is at stake if there is a war? The lives of Iranians and Israelis, oil supplies, the stability in the region. And to me, as an Iranian, the most important question is the future of Iranian society, its civil society, which showed signs of maturity in 2009. It came out on the streets in huge numbers. And then it made a conscious decision to withdraw from the streets because there was no other alternative. The sanctions are already undermining Iranian civil society. And if there is a war, it's going to be worse. The Iranian regime would be able easily to galvanize the whole country behind an external enemy. So I think the first goal has to be avoid such a situation. I think either the Americans should go as far as offering some kind of a package to Iran that it wouldn't be able to say no. I mean, Iranians have said that they want to continue enriching uranium and that they want the sanctions to be lifted. The most important thing is to bring the Iranians to the negotiation tables. The Iranians have said that they are interested to have their nuclear program invested in. So this is one way to bring them to negotiation table, let Iranian civil society to decide what it wants to do. I mean, the West and Iranian society have one mutual enemy, and that is the Islamic Republic. What do you do about it when you have one ally? Do you undermine them? Do you make them weaker? Or if this is not an option, why don't you strengthen the Iranian opposition?
Thank you. We've heard a range of pretty interesting views here. I now want to turn this over to questions from the audience. There are 4 microphones, 2 up above in the landings there, 2 down here. Please line up and follow the usual format here, which is first, when I call on you, please identify yourself. Second, state a brief question, not a long speech. And third, remember that a question ends in a question mark. And let me start with the gentleman right here.
Sure. I'm Josh Lipson, a sophomore at Harvard College, and this question is addressed to everyone on the panel. To what degree does the possibility of the Assad regime's fall sometime over the course of the next few months affect the Iranian security calculation, whether it makes Iran feel as though its ability to project power in the Levant could change and could force an acceleration of nuclear capability pursuit, or something in the opposite direction, forcing Iran toward conciliation?
Who wants to take a swing at that?
Well, I think the Iranians are looking at events in Syria very closely. First of all, Iran is very much present in Syria. It's helping the Syrian regime to repress the protests. On the other hand, it does want to see Assad in power, because then it will lose a major strategic ally. But most of all, it's interested at this stage because Syria is one of the major international issues. Once everything ends in Syria, Iran's significance and its nuclear program is going to be high priority again. So, I mean, it has 2 very strategic interests in Syria.
Okay.
Well, I was at a meeting with some Iranian colleagues in Istanbul just a few weeks ago, and the Syria question was very much in the front of the minds of the Westerners who were involved in this meeting. And one of the responses, the Iranian colleagues were much more sanguine about the implications. Firstly, they're not as convinced as the West that Assad is going to fall. Secondly, Assad is a limited asset in the best of circumstances as an ally. But there is a question of power projection, the logistical convenience, and some would say necessity of Syria to feed stuff into Lebanon could be important. But the last point they made, and the one that they were most emphatic about, was they said, what makes you think that Assad is the only connection we have in Syria?
Very interesting. Okay. Sir.
My name is Farid Masroor. I'm Iranian. I teach philosophy at the philosophy department here. I'm a college fellow. I grew up in Iran and came to the United States in 2001. And I'm still in contact with Iran. I have my family there. I go back and forth. So I just wanted to put a question on the table that I think is in the minds of a lot of middle-class Iranians who, some of them live in Iran, some of them live here. And the question is about the idea that Iran poses a very serious threat, maybe existential or a dire threat to Israel or maybe the rest of the international community. Many people in Iran think that claim or that assumption is based on two types of evidence. One of them is Iranian rhetoric, and the other one is the evidence that exists for Iran's support of, for example, groups like Hamas or Hezbollah that have been in conflict with the state of Israel. But a lot of people in Iran think that those two pieces of evidence are not serious indications of anything like an intention to directly attack Israel, for example, with a nuclear weapon. And one reason is that a lot of these people have grown up in this country, and we have been exposed to the rhetoric of the Iranian government, and it's not clear to us that that should be taken seriously. But a more serious reason is that, I think we should distinguish between a government or a state finding it in its national interest to have a violent rhetoric against another country, and finding it in its national interest to support some groups that are in conflict with that country, and
your question is?
Just two sentences. Finding it in its national interest to attack another country. And during the Cold War, we had two forces that had rhetoric against each other. They supported proxy wars against each other, but they never attacked each other because it wasn't in their national interest to do that. Why is it? The question is this. Why is it that it is assumed that based on just this rhetorical evidence and the evidence of support for these groups, it's concluded that Iran poses a very serious threat to the security of the state of Israel?
Chuck, it seems to me that's directed to you.
But I think you overlooked the primary source of evidence. It's not the rhetoric and it's not the support for Hezbollah or Hamas. The primary source of evidence is the IAEA, which submitted a report recently saying that Iran seems to have a nuclear weapons program. It's the fact that you have virtually certainly government in the West and many governments beyond that today, who are all firmly convinced that Iran is pursuing a military nuclear program. The only real question that serious people are raising today is whether Iran wants to go the whole way, or maybe they'll stop at the threshold. This isn't a case of, it doesn't seem to be a case of the mistaken intelligence in the case of Iraq. This is a case where any government of any substance in the world today is telling you Iran is pursuing a military nuclear program. So let's take it seriously. And the question then is how we deal with it. And you gave the example, well, the US-Soviet confrontation. I don't know to what extent that comparison is really edifying here, because there were a couple of differences that are very important. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union ever sought to destroy each other as a nation. The US wanted to defeat the communist system. The Soviets wanted to destroy the American democratic system. They never wanted to wipe out every last American. They weren't trying to destroy the United States. Here we have a country which says something else, which calls for Israel's extermination. Here we have a regime which is a theocratic regime. And I think when you bring God into the picture, you're talking a totally different picture. I think the Iranians, by the way, I think they're rational actors. I think they're extremists. I think they're rational. I hope I'm right. But the minute you bring God into the picture, it's totally different, because then rationality can become very different. And there's a third difference, and that is that the US and the Soviet Union talked in a variety of channels. They had embassies. They had military attachés. They had 100 different ways. They had a hotline. They had 100 different ways of communicating to hopefully avert a crisis. Iran refuses to have anything to do with Israel. That's a big difference.
Steve, did you want to comment on this at all, either of you? Okay. Good. Gentleman up here.
Hello, my name is Jacob Merlo. I am at the college, and I'm asking this question on behalf of the Forum Committee here at the IOP. So my question is, what role could the United Nations potentially play in this? Are they in a position to mediate this situation? Will they? What realistically could be done, and what could we see in the future?
It's a great question, David.
Very good question. Well, it's not like this is a new issue to the United Nations. This issue has been in front of the Security Council now for 5 or 6 years. There's been, 4 separate resolutions, I think. The first ones were just hortatory. Then there was the beginning of sanctions, and then a ramped-up set of sanctions that one of our colleagues here, Nick Burns, negotiated out. And one of the most difficult issues that I think the UN now has in dealing with Iran is that the Iranians believe that the Security Council has announced a position on this. And their position is that even though Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel is not, Pakistan is not, North Korea has dropped out, India never signed, that Iran, in the UN view, is cheating within the system. That's the Iranian view of this. And that therefore the UN has sort of come down on one side by demanding an immediate halt to all enrichment activity while some solution is negotiated out. And so part of the difficulty for the UN to enter in is that if they try to come in as a neutral right now, they would basically have to walk away or walk back from the Security Council's demand that all enrichment has to stop. And basically everything the West is doing right now, the sanctions, all of the other action, is based on the UN demand, which has so far been ignored, that all of this enrichment activity has to stop. So it's not as if you're bringing the UN in for the first time as a neutral player.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add quickly. I mean, what Iran has done in its nuclear program falls entirely in the realm of permitted activity under the NPT and IAEA. So the entire legal basis of the case against Iran lies in these Chapter 7 Security Council resolutions, which under the UN Charter are mandatory. So the UN Security Council is demanding in a mandatory, obligatory way that Iran cease its enrichment program. So Iran is one of the major instruments being used against Iran, and absent the UN Security Council resolution, there is no basis other than our distaste for the path that Iran is on to act against them.
They were found in violation of a whole slew of international commitments, IAEA commitment.
No, I'm sorry. The Iranians committed a large number of safeguards violations that fell 100% in the area of reportage. They failed to report this. They failed to provide that information. Enrichment is permitted. Reprocessing is permitted. Holding inventories of LEU is permitted. Secret installations are only required to be declared within 6 months of when the nuclear material will be submitted, which was not the case in any of the Iranian cases. I don't mean to defend them. I'm just saying these are the facts.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Joel Branald. I'm a grad student here at HKS. One of the questions is, how can people reassure Israel that when their back's against the wall, that they'll actually stand up, and if there was an attack, that anyone would sort of even come to the aid, or would the world just sort of forget? And it's very much dug within the Jewish psyche today. So my question to the panel, and specifically to Chuck, in terms of within the Israeli decision-making, as you understand it, would legal treaties help so that Israel could enter in as a treaty ally with other countries in the West, that if they were attacked specifically by Iran with conventional and non-conventional warfare, that other countries would be legally obligated? Would that help reassure Israel in any way, shape, or form?
Okay, that's an interesting question. First of all, there's one school of thought that says that what Israel is actually asking for at the moment is not for international backing or for American intervention on its behalf, but quite the opposite, that the U.S., if the U.S. doesn't want to do it, that it should just step aside and allow Israel to do it. But your question is saying, well, if no one is to attack, what are the alternative solutions? And one of the ideas that has been raised is an American, or you're raising the possibility of an international security guarantee. The international guarantee, I think, is a total non-starter. Israel isn't going to put its hand, no country would put its security in the hands of a broad international coalition. By the time anybody did anything, if they did anything, so people say, well, how about a NATO guarantee? Well, to get 27 countries on board, Israel might long have ceased to exist. The real question is whether maybe there might be an American guarantee. And you can make the case and point the fact that really it probably exists today, a guarantee for Israel's existence, even though there is no formal security. There is no formal alliance. I think de facto there pretty much is. And then again, if you're the Israeli decision maker, you have to ask yourself, well, the U.S. has a pretty good record when it comes to maintaining commitments, but it's not 100%. The United States is 6,000 miles away. The rocket fly time is a few minutes. Are you really willing to rely on that? It's, I think, a debatable issue. There are important thinkers in Israel who say that that might be a reasonable compromise. And also take into account, Steve was saying in his introductory remarks, Steve Walt, that Israel is thought to be a nuclear power in its own right. Israel should be able to handle the problem from that point of view on its own. The question in the end boils down to, do you believe that Iran is a rational actor or not? And what are the risks if you're wrong?
I should just add that Chuck and I do not always agree on every issue, but we agree on that one. I think the security guarantees in this case would not be sufficient, although in some other contexts, I think they have been, where the United States has been able to extend security guarantees to countries and reassure them on various nuclear questions. But I would take Chuck's second point, but in a slightly different direction. I believe that the reason Israel does not have to worry as much about Iran as they appear to is precisely the fact that Israel has a robust nuclear deterrent of its own, which it's not about to give up. And therefore, I don't think the danger of an Iranian attack is particularly high. I think the analogy to the Cold War works actually remarkably well. You'll remember that the Soviet and Chinese leadership at various periods were led by some quite brutal mass murderers, in the case of Mao Zedong, and the Soviet leadership as well, and yet behaved with remarkable restraint. In fact, if you look more broadly at what happens to countries after they go nuclear, most countries who have crossed the nuclear threshold actually get involved in fewer interstate disputes and initiate fewer interstate disputes after they cross the nuclear threshold than before. But I can also understand why that might not reassure Chuck completely. Next question, I guess, is here.
Reg McKean, Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. As one who believes an Israeli attack would be a disaster for Israel and for the United States, I'd like to know from the panel if the United States can and would be able to stop such a disaster for both of our countries.
Who wants to start?
I'll start with a couple of observations. One of the most interesting questions that we debate out with the Obama administration as reporters is, first, would Israel seek permission ahead of time? To which usually people say, no, Israel would never put itself in the position of formally asking for permission, and Chuck will know much more about this. Second, would Israel notify the United States that it was on the way? And here you'd have to look at an example like the attack on the Syrian reactor in 2007, where the American notification was very, very brief. I mean, the Americans saw it was coming. Prior to that attack, the Israelis had asked President Bush to attack the reactor himself. He declined. Then the Israelis asked for a number of technological aids. They declined. The Israelis went ahead and did this anyway. The Bush administration had wanted to take the issue to the UN. By the way, if you want two very different versions of those events, go read President Bush's autobiography, which came out last year, and then read Vice President Cheney's autobiography. And ask yourself the question, were these two men sitting in the same meetings?
It makes us wonder about the reliability of the historical record. Okay.
I'd like to add,
Sure.
I'm not going to comment on the American response here, but I do want to comment on your premise that an attack would be a catastrophe. And I think people throw that out too easily, and don't take me now as being an advocate of military action. I said before, I think you have to really be on the inside to make an informed judgment. But I do think the conclusion that it's a catastrophe is unbased. First of all, in terms of the response against the United States. To think that Iran really wants to get into any kind of shooting war with the United States, I think is far-fetched. I think it's unrealistic. Will there be some sort of, and it doesn't matter by who attacks. If the man on the moon attacks, they will claim that it's a joint American-Israeli collusion. Okay, that's clear. The thought that they want to get into a shooting war with the United States, will there be some tiny pinprick to make it look good? I would imagine. Do you really think they want to go beyond that? When they have a really good solution from their perspective, and one which they'll even get some sympathy for in the world, why not respond against Israel? I think that's where they'll respond big time, not against the U.S. And Israel is going to face, what I said before, is an absolutely excruciating decision. Is the time that can be gained through military action, and it should only be considered as a last resort when we've really gotten down to the wire, is that time gain worth what's going to be a painful price?
Just as a footnote, by the way, to the last comment, there was a piece I saw on the web today by Frank Gavin of the University of Texas and Jim Steinberg, the former Deputy Secretary of State, basically commenting on all of this speculation and making the point that nobody actually knows what would happen, and therefore people who are very optimistic about how easy it might be or very pessimistic about the catastrophe it might cause are both wrong, or at least they're wrong if they're stating so with any degree of certainty whatsoever. It's well worth taking a look at. I thought it was a thoughtful piece. Lady up here, please.
Hi, my name is Juliana Shamidas. I'm a PhD student at Columbia University visiting. My question is about potential alternatives to war. And in fact, I'd just like to follow up something that Steve Walt started talking about somewhat spontaneously a few minutes ago, which is the idea of accepting a nuclear Iran. So barring the question of whether or not Iran is developing a bomb or not, what if, are there any people within the United States that are seriously considering this question of accepting a nuclear Iran? And if so, why don't we hear their voices more loudly?
David, I think that's in your...
Sure. You know, Steve asked at the beginning, are there divisions within the Obama administration? I would say that one of the continuing divisions, although it's an issue down the line, is could the United States live with a nuclear Iran if everything else here fails? And then a second version of this, which I think gets to a question that Steve raised when he said that they essentially have most of the technology now, which is, are we living with a nuclear-capable Iran today, which is to say it wouldn't take them terribly long to build a weapon, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. Some people believe it's shorter. And so it really is a much more complex question than the on-off switch of, if Iran had a weapon, would it have much more influence in the region? Would it be able to threaten other states in the region? Or if it didn't have a weapon, would it have none? What if you live in this ambiguous world where we all believe that it wouldn't take Iran very long to get to a weapon? And then it gets to an issue that Chuck raised, which goes to intent. Japan, for all practical purposes, is in this virtual nuclear state position. I mean, they got the fuel. No one doubts the Japanese engineers have the technology. They certainly have delivery systems. Okay? But we're not sitting around worrying about what a virtual Japanese nuclear state could be. I bet we have never held a forum on this issue. Okay? Okay. So that goes to the question of intent. And I think there is a fairly active debate, both inside and outside the administration, that says, could you live with the ambiguity? And I think more and more people are thinking you probably could live with the ambiguity, but you could never step out and say that publicly, you know, if you were a government official.
Yeah, I think that's right. And by the way, the definition of a nuclear Iran itself is both on the dimension of capability, but one can imagine an Iran with a different government. And then if one imagined that, would we have the same attitude towards an Iranian enrichment program or possible, you know, shades of the movement towards an actual capability, actual weapons capability? Let's see. Let me go down here and then up there. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcia Dubrow. I'm a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. My question is directed principally to Charles and David. but I invite anyone to respond. And it really deals with the realm of the concrete rather than the hypothetical. I refer to Ronan Bergman's very penetrating and provocative article in the New York Times Magazine section of January 29th, during which he concludes that it's not a question of will Israel have a nuclear strike on Iran, but when. And I would like you to respond to that question directly in terms of whether or not you agree with his perspective, and also in terms of the timeline that he lays out from the Israeli perspective, which I believe is 6 to 9 months, and the American perspective where the response has been 15 months or thereabouts. Thank you.
I just want to clarify. You said a nuclear strike on Iran, and I assume you meant a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities,
exactly.
Not a nuclear
yes.
attack. Okay, we want to be very clear about that.
And thank you very much.
There's a difference.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, David and Chuck, you in whichever order. Chuck.
Start with Chuck. The article basically took you inside the Israeli thinking on this issue. So.
I must say my take on the article was, I was less wowed by the article than the questioner seems to be. I think Bergman is trying to sell a book which is coming out, and I admire him from that point of view. I've got one coming out also, and I'm not going to sell as many as he did. I think his argument, or as he will, his argument I think was, well, he clearly had some good sources. He was talking to the defense minister. But the argument that he presents there, that Israel's going to attack sometime this year, was based on 3 assumptions. I only remember a couple of them. But one was, for example, that let's say the operational capability has now gelled this year, where it hadn't been in the past, that the U.S. response is now favorable. And he had a third argument, which I forget. Well, I don't know, and I don't know that anything significant has changed in Israel's military capabilities in the last year that would lead one to think that that's true. And everything that I understand about American policy, and there are people here who are better qualified to speak than I am, that the U.S. is totally against this. So I think it was a good piece for other reasons. I'll leave it at that.
I would say on this that the piece gave a very clear understanding of how Israel thinks about this, but it didn't explore, it was written in Israel, from the Israeli point of view. It didn't explore the issue that Chuck earlier tonight said was the first question that came up at any Israeli meeting on these subjects, which is how would the United States respond? Because if not withheld by the United States, I think you could argue that Israel might have acted 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, there have been constraints on Israel here during the Bush administration. There have been constraints on Israel during the Obama administration. So then comes the question, what is it that both of these administrations together are trying to do? I don't believe that either one of them believes that you could do anything that would completely stop the program, because much of the program is in people's heads, right? So then the question is, what could slow the program the most? And the American argument to Israel has essentially boiled down, and argue with me here if any of you think that I've got this wrong, that there are things you can do that slow the program as much or more without having to put up with the backlash from an attack. And the covert program was an example of that. The sanctions now that they affect oil revenues may be an example of that. And the possibility of diplomatic options could also slow it if those options included getting some of the fuel out of the country. So I think the essence of the American argument is that we're nowhere near the point of having to be at last resort, which would be a military strike, that there are more effective ways to accomplish the same. I'm not sure the Israeli establishment buys that.
Very quickly, Steve.
I was just going to add from the perspective of someone who's been immersed. I'm a non-proliferation wonk by profession, and I've been immersed in this Iran thing since it erupted in 2002. This is the latest version of the annual war scare story. And last year it was Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic magazine. And if you go back before our election, it was more commonly addressed at the intentions of the Bush administration than the Israelis. But this crops up every time. Every time there are reasons to think that it might be something seriously to worry about. On the other hand, it hasn't yet happened.
Gentleman up here.
Good evening. My name is Stephen Pickner. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. My question is about the Saudis and others in the Gulf. How willing are they to tolerate an Iranian nuclear weapon, and what range, to include going themselves nuclear, are they willing to undertake? Thank you.
We don't have a resident Saudi expert on the panel.
We can say a couple of things about it. Yeah. I mean, the fact is the Saudis asked the United States to deal with the issue militarily. And there have been reports that the Saudis are beginning to look at a nuclear program of their own. And if they're no longer totally confident of the American security commitment to them, there are also reports that maybe they're looking at some sort of relationship with Pakistan. So I think what you see is that all of the Sunni states today are deeply, deeply concerned about this. Not just the Saudis, a whole variety of countries have begun civil nuclear programs. We know from bitter experience what tends to happen with civil nuclear programs, at least in the Middle Eastern context.
I would add just a point to that. I've occasionally wondered, without an enormous amount of evidence, that this might be actually one reason why Iran might want a latent capability, but actually not cross the threshold to weaponizing. That if they were to do that, it might, not necessarily, but it might then trigger other countries nearby to pursue a nuclear option themselves. And if you look at it from a long-term perspective, Iran is a potentially much more powerful country, larger population, greater economic potential. If the region stays largely conventional, Iran could be the most powerful country in the Persian Gulf region. If everybody else starts getting nuclear weapons, that might actually not be in Iran's long-term interest. So if I were an Iranian strategic planner, I might want to have a latent capability, but I would think long and hard about whether or not I wanted to actually cross the threshold, which raises all sorts of complications, both within the region and with others. The last question will be you up here.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Gordon. I'm a master's student at the Fletcher School and Urban Planning at Tufts University. And my question is about the recent attacks on and deaths of Iranian nuclear scientists and other personnel, and I'd love to hear your insights into who is responsible, who is involved, and what have been the implications of these attacks on the program itself in Iran, as well as on Iranian thinking about the nuclear program.
Okay. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to that question, but also to add any closing remarks that they want to make. So whoever wants to address this directly, yes, but I want everyone here to get a last word in on what we've been talking about.
Yeah. You know, I'll tell you the common speculation, of course, and it is speculation, is that the Israelis have trained up some local Iranians who were presumably quite committed dissidents to plant these sticky bombs that you've seen happen. But so far, I've seen no concrete evidence of this. It's a widespread assumption. I have had a number of U.S. officials go out of their way to tell me that the U.S. has not been involved in these. And I thought it was interesting that after the last assassination of a scientist about a month ago, Hillary Clinton came out that morning quite publicly to both condemn it and say the United States was not involved. Your second part of your question was, what's the effect been on the program? I can't believe in a program that's this large that the assassination now of 3 or 4 or 5 scientists would make that big a difference. But there is a big psychological effect on this, which is that whoever is doing it, and including if it was Israel or anybody else, any other power trying to stop them, is that it makes a scientist think hard before joining what has until now been one of the most elite programs within the Iranian sphere. And so it creates a psychological barrier of some kind and makes it clear that there's a potential cost. But could that alone stop the program? It strikes me as not likely.
There have been 5 Iranian scientists assassinated since 2007, and a 6th attempt was made unsuccessfully on the life of the current head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Agency. I agree with Chuck that this is not likely to derail or even, David, that this is not likely to derail or stop the program. But it gets to this question that Steve asked me earlier about the whole issue of why didn't the Iranians respond more favorably to the engagement, the so-called engagement. And David himself, when he was describing it, basically said 3 policies: the hand of engagement, mobilization for sanctions, and relentless covert operations. So your scientists are being assassinated, your facilities are mysteriously being blown up, your program is being sabotaged, your airspace is being surveilled by American drones, your sovereignty is being disrespected. There are published reports of cross-border raids by American forces onto Iranian territory. The Persian Gulf is an American lake. The airspace in the northern Persian Gulf is completely dominated by American air power. The bulk of deployable ground combat forces of the United States of America is on the eastern and western frontiers of Iran. And we're saying, well, here's the hand of friendship. And all of this is in the context of the fact that since the mid-1990s, the declared, articulated, legally codified policy of the United States toward Iran is regime change. So they feel under siege. And they then are very trepidatious about dealing with us. Meanwhile, in their narrative, and I agree with David, there are 2 parallel narratives here about what happened, what's happened, and who's done what, and what the motivations are on various sides. There are very few points of tangency between those 2 narratives. In the Iranian narrative, they have been trying to reach out to the United States since the late 1990s. They've made overture after offer after gesture, and in every case, they've been either ignored or rejected or, in some cases, ridiculed. And often we don't even bother to decline their overtures, we just ignore them. And so their view is, we're the problem. The Iranians, if you go to, one last point here, so every year, Ahmadinejad has a dinner in New York when he's there for the General Assembly meeting, and he invites a bunch of us. Graham and I usually go. And every year, Ahmadinejad says the same thing. He says, we want to talk. We're willing to talk. If Obama wants to talk, I'm in New York. He knows where to find me. Let's sit down and talk man to man. All right? What's the problem? Why can't we talk? He's not saying we won't talk, the Supreme Leader won't let me talk, we can't do anything. He's saying we're happy to talk, but we're not going to capitulate. We're not going to make gigantic concessions in advance of the negotiations, which is generally what we're asking them to do. And we want to talk about things that we care about as well as things that you care about, which is something that we've been very reluctant to do.
I think that any and every effort to try and reach a negotiated settlement should be made. I differ with Steve in the assessment of what's happened till now, in the sense that actually the Clinton administration in '97 first made an offer to begin speaking and apologized to Iran for any perceived misdeeds on the part of the United States. And there have been repeated attempts to reach out since then. And there, as Steve said, there are competing narratives about what happened here. They are competing. I tend to attach greater credibility to the American narrative rather than to the Iranian one. We are talking about a regime which I think has good reasons of its own for wanting the capability. I started out with that, and we have to understand that. But the fact that they want it isn't enough. So let's put an offer on the table. It's been there. If it has to be renewed, if it isn't clear to anybody, let's renew it. I would try and address any reasonable security concern that Iran has. But the bottom line is that Iran should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. And that's not just an Israeli issue. It's an issue for the Arab countries. For the first time in the history of the conflict, we have a joint interest. And it's an interest of the entire international community.
Nazila?
I want to go back to the issue of the assassination of Iranian scientists. This is one of those topics that can make a lot of Iranians to sympathize with the regime. some of these people, including one of the scientists who was assassinated in the summer, was this very, very young man. We're not even sure if he was aware that the kind of work that he was doing was part of the work that contributes to the nuclear program, or the first scientist who was assassinated, or perhaps the second one, in January 2010. At that time, it was very much perceived that perhaps his death was linked to the repression against the dissidents, because he had been one of the people who had signed a petition in support of the Iranian opposition. And later on, when it became clear that there was actually an effort to eliminate people who were working for the nuclear program, a lot of reaction appeared on social networking websites. So, I mean, if there are efforts to bring Iranians to the negotiation tables, and the assassinations are not helping to derail Iran's nuclear program, I think this is one of those things that will push Iranians further to sympathize with the regime.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our time period. I previously had asked the panelists what they hoped would happen and what they thought would happen. I will now give you my answer on that one to close it out. I hope that this issue would be resolved and we could therefore devote future forums to other topics. But what I expect is that this is not the last time the forum will address this particular issue. And with that, please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you. That was great. Very nicely done.
There's almost a mirror image. Both sides think that they've been reaching out.